You've got your paper written, it's ready to go. So how do you decide which journal is going to hopefully publish your paper? There are 3 basic questions that I recommend. How do I reach the right audience for my paper most effectively? How long should I expect to wait for a decision? This can be important in certain situations where if you have a deadline that you're working toward. And what is the reputation of the journal? And this is probably most important because the reputation of the journal still carries a lot of weight with different evaluators. We'll talk about the metric side of it in a minute, but what you'll find is that people sometimes use the journal as a shortcut to filter based on quality. So by extension, the reputation of a journal becomes attached to your paper in that journal. How do you identify an appropriate journal? One is you can look at the references. Right? If you're citing an article that was published in another journal that is very relevant to your research, they've already indicated they're interested in this kind of research. So maybe that's a potential home. There's a number of different sources you can use for keywords, PubMed, Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, they go on. Asking your supervisor or colleagues for recommendations. This is where you get the inside information sometimes that no journal is going to publicize about itself. But journals are driven by people. They're human enterprises, ultimately. And so this is where your PI might be able to say, I know the new editor-in-chief of that particular journal, this is not an area that they're that interested in encouraging, or maybe this is an area they're really excited about, and that's where they want to see the journal moving. You also get some of the experiences, the personal experiences people have had with the journal. I submitted to them several times over the years, and I've never gotten back a decision earlier than 6 months. Right? This is important information for you to know. So talking to people. Librarians. Not only do they help broker the access to all of the journals, they also have any number of databases, resources for analyzing, finding out information about those journals. And even if it's a journal they're not familiar with, they have the tools that they can use to drill in deeper and find more information that will hopefully inform your decision. You could use a free service. Pretty much every publisher has their own at this point, and there are some publisher-agnostic cross-publisher ones where you paste in your abstract and it spits out some recommendations about what journal might work. It's a matchmaker, and I find that you want to use more than one, and you also have to go in with a bit of a sense of humor to this, because like with any matchmaker, you're going to get some obvious answers. You're going to get some that, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. And then you're going to get some that really make you question what this tool is reading into you and your research that made it think that this was a good idea. So just be mindful of that, and do try a few if that's the route you want to go. Always make sure you've read the aims and scope for any prospective journal. Just because something looks like it's a good fit based on its title, based on some of these other evaluations, doesn't mean that that's really the aspect of research that they're interested in. So take a look at the aims and scope. What do they list out as fields they're interested in? Are there any particular approaches that they're more interested in, mechanistic versus translational versus clinical, et cetera? You always want to make sure you're realistic about your paper. Realistically, the first journal you submit to is probably not going to be the journal that ends up publishing it. Most papers do get submitted more than once. So think about, where do I want to be submitting it? What kind of research do I have here? Do I have New England Journal of Medicine paper? If you do, that's great. It's certainly a prestigious journal with a very high rejection rate. So think carefully before you invest that time and that energy. Is this where you want to go? Is it the leading journal in my specialty? Is that a better home for it? So think carefully, and like with applying for college, don't stop, don't not go for the stretch school. Certainly know where you're probably going to end up, and maybe have a safety school or two in mind just in case. But you just want to do that work up front, and you'll end up saving yourself hopefully some time and energy. Yes?
So I'm not sure if you're going to talk about it soon, but about the predatory journals. And sometimes if you're not familiar with a journal outside your own field, I usually run it against the Beals list to make sure it's not on there.
That's a great, actually, recommendation for that, and I am going to talk about it on the next slide. Which is perfect. So I'm framing it more as new journals, right? Journals that you don't know, journals that you're not familiar with. It could be a journal that just launched. Because you have to be perhaps more diligent with them than with any other journal. Obviously, a journal that's been around for 150 years, it's hard for them to fake it for that long without that reputation getting out. A new journal, it's a little bit more feasible. And of course, it's worth noting that every journal was new at some point, right? So just because it's new does not make it inherently bad or inherently something that you need to be unnecessarily suspicious of. But you do have to do due diligence. So there's some questions to ask. Who's involved, and are they really? Take a look at the editorial board. Take a look at any authors who've published in it already. If it's the editorial board you're looking at, if it's someone who you know or you know someone who knows, it doesn't hurt to reach out to them and just make sure that they really are affiliated with it, because there are known scams where people will just list random researchers, sometimes not even real researchers, to make their editorial boards look good. I've seen cases where people use stock imagery from a Google search and put that person as their editor because they know the images make it look that much more legitimate. Sorry, Lana, you've heard this story before. I found one which I wish I had screenshotted at the time. I was looking at a list of editors, and I thought, that face looks familiar. And it was Taylor Swift, who I'm sure has many talents, but probably was not qualified to be the editor of this engineering journal that I was looking at. So take a look at that, be mindful, and be critical, like with anything you find on the internet, right? Ask yourself, what promises are made regarding peer review? A reference was made to the term predatory journal. What this usually means is the idea that they are extracting money for you without providing really any service. And for journals, a lot of this is around peer review, certainly. And if it's a journal that says, we will turn your paper around in 24 hours, fantastic for you, but the chances of them sending it out to external reviewers who will say, sure, I'd like to review this, then actually review it, then return those reviews, then the editor looks at those reviews and makes a decision within 24 hours are remarkably slim. And yes, some papers, a very small percentage, have been sent out for, or have been accepted without going out for peer review. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But in general, this is something that you should be expecting. Has the journal, oh yes, please.
Well, no, there's just some really kind of funny, interesting stories on the web if you search, where people will submit things to these predatory journals with, every other word's an expletive, or, autocorrect off your phone, and they just instantly publish it, and they say, just pay us $500 and we'll publish your study.
Yep.
And it's just absolute gibberish.
Yep.
But also, if you have a legitimate paper and you accidentally send it to one of those journals, they're going to sit on it forever. It will never get published. And then you, because of the ethics, you can't submit it to a real journal to get it published. So you end up really stuck.
Just to build on that a little bit, so the main company that's involved with this is called Omnix International. It's in India. And they have thousands of these predatory journals, but they also have these predatory conferences, and you might get an email inviting you to be a speaker, and it's like some conference in India, or you might be asked to be on the editorial board of a journal, and you'd be like, wow, this is really nice. It'll be nice to put on my CV, but don't do it. That's like a predatory journal. Once they get your name, it's going to stay on there. It's going to be hard to retract that, and that's going to impair your future career. So you got to be really careful about this. And the librarian that kind of keeps track of this is a guy named Beall, B-E-A-L-L. He's in Denver. So he keeps a list of all the predatory journals out there, and it's well over, I think now, 2,000 journals.
Just quickly on that, he doesn't anymore. That was taken down for some reasons. But yes.
But there is a website that it does keep up.
Yep.
Uses his list and keeps up with new lists. And it's
Yep.
not only Omnix, there's a lot of lists.
Yep. Yeah.
And these emails always, every morning, they come at between 1 and 6 a.m. So when you wake up and you look at your email, these types of emails. But all of these points just remind us that please, if you have a question, speak to team members, speak to senior folks in the department, or the librarians, especially Liz Ayers and Tracy Tosh, from the medical student perspective, but from all perspectives, I think it's important to reach out. If you see something that doesn't make sense, please ask.
Yeah. And I understand that the librarians have actually been going around to different departments giving talks on this topic, so if you're interested in hearing more. So some other questions to ask. Has the journal published any articles yet, and are they any good? There's sometimes an advantage to being a first mover. I would argue this might be a situation where it's not. You're judged by the company you keep and the journal's reputation, so take a look at the articles that are coming out. Are they good? Are they from people who you would be comfortable being published in the same journal with? Are they legitimate researchers in your field? Often overlooked one, what are the journal's archiving policies if publication ceases? It can be relatively easy to create a dishonest journal. Anyone with 5 minutes on a website can do that. Creating a legitimate journal takes quite a bit more endeavor. But to create an illegitimate one, no problem. Which is fine because it's also very easy to shut down. So if you're entrusting your article to this, as was mentioned, ethically, right, it's already been submitted, it's already been published, your hands are kind of tied if that journal folds. So investigate what are their policies. If you go out of business, if this journal disappears, what happens to my article? I highlight a couple of initiatives here which are aimed at archiving content in journals or publishers that go out of business. Clocks and Portico, they maintain essentially a dark archive. If that journal goes out of business, the content becomes available through another source. So my take-homes here are beware of predatory journals, but remember not all journals are predatory. Another one that sometimes can be troubling, the time was mentioned. Sometimes people will look at the level of English on a website, right? And certainly there might be reasons to make you take an extra look at that journal, but also we need to be mindful that we are not biasing ourselves against journals from parts of the world where maybe the level of English isn't as high, where maybe there are some complications. So I think that that's the difficult balance we're trying to walk here, is how do you use certain things as tells that maybe there's something worth investigating versus a journal that's being launched perfectly legitimately, best of intentions, but doesn't necessarily have some of those same elements that we would expect. Remember, even for legitimate journals, new journals will not yet be indexed in Medline, PubMed, or other services. They won't have an impact factor that can take years after launch. So just be mindful of this. I've launched new journals over my career, and usually within, say, the first 3 papers that get published, someone will write to me and say, great, when's it show up in PubMed? It doesn't work that way. PubMed wants to know that a journal is going to be around for a little while. So you have to have a certain corpus. You have to have built up a certain volume of published articles before you can index in PubMed Central, before you can submit to Medline. And they do have standards. They do go through and evaluate. And a lot of journals get rejected on the first try and have to go back. So just be aware of this in terms of the visibility of your article. Not necessarily a reason to avoid the journal, just trying to avoid surprises. And there is a website, thinkchecksubmit.org, which has some other good questions that you might consider asking. I've made reference to the impact factor a couple of times. I think it's worth acknowledging because I think we all know that in certain evaluation committees, promotion tenure committees, sometimes funders, the impact factor does carry some weight. It's a metric that was originally created to help librarians make decisions between journals in the same field, particularly understanding the fact that you couldn't be experts in every journal. It has taken on this life of its own and is now used for all sorts of things it was never originally intended to be used for. That doesn't make it necessarily a bad metric, just a metric that maybe is being misapplied in some circumstances. So what is the actual impact factor? How do you determine it? There's a number of times that papers in a journal are cited on average. However, so to take the current impact factor, the one that you'd find if you went to any journal promoting its impact factors webpage. The current impact factor is based on 2017 cites to articles that were published in 2016 and 15. And then you divide by the number of articles published in 2016 and 2015. So you can probably see right away that this is a very small window that you're looking at. If you have this one article that gets really popular 5 years later, it's not going to affect the journal's impact factor. It's not going to have any influence. If you've got one article that gets 100 citations and you only publish 2 other articles and they get 0, you have an impact factor of 33. That looks great. So it can be really thrown off by the size of the journal, what I call blockbuster effect, if you've got these really big performing articles. It can also be influenced by editorial policies. Not necessarily gaming the system, although I talked earlier about letters to the editor and why they may be called that. But review articles tend to be cited on average about 30% more than original articles. So if you look at lists of the highest impact factor journals in any category, you usually find review journals tend to gravitate towards the top. If a journal publishes 5 original articles and 25 reviews, it has a better chance of having a higher impact factor. So there are a number of factors that go into it that you should probably be aware of for using it to determine too much. I don't want to downplay the significance of it to certain evaluators. So know your own field, know what people are likely to be looking at, but I would encourage you to not make your decisions about what journal to publish in entirely based on one metric. Yes?
The impact factor can also be influenced by the editor themselves. There are some who, when you submit, they insist that you cite a certain number of papers from that journal. There are also some who write sort of an editorial at the end of the year where they cite every paper that was submitted or published in that year. So there are lots of ways of gaming that system.
It's very true. I mean, any metric, it's amazing the creativity you see. If you are asked as a condition of acceptance that you cite a certain number of articles from that journal, just so you know that's not okay. That's pretty much universally frowned on at this point. So if you see that, just know that and think about who you might alert. Did you have?
The other point, I think we have to have a balanced approach to the impact factor, and there are also very reputable sources of impact factors within any given field, which I think can also help you to understand journals, especially when you speak with mentors and other members of the team, because otherwise you may continue to go back to the journals that you've previously been involved with, and it's good to have a broader view.
Yep, it's certainly a good way of exploring new journals. Sometimes you run into problems if you try to compare across fields. We talked about, originally it was created to compare journals within a field for specific use, and I think that's what you're referring to there as well. If you go across fields, you can actually see substantially high variation. These are the highest impact factor journals in different fields. And we talked earlier about how, say, computer science has very different citation patterns than pediatrics. And so what you see here reflected is, again, there are a number of journals that probably are not surprising. You see some review journals that rise to the top, but you see a lot of variation from, say, JAMA Pediatrics with 10.769 to Biomaterials 8.78 down to the highest nursing journal, International Study of Nursing Studies, International Journal of Nursing Studies 3.656. Does that mean the articles in one are better than the articles in another just because the impact factor is higher? Probably not. It's all about the citation patterns. For a nursing journal, for example, that field is very heavily based on practitioners, not necessarily researchers. A successful article in that field isn't necessarily going to be cited 1,000 times. It'll hopefully be read. It'll have implications on clinical practice. Some of the broader fields, like say a pediatrics, if you think about pediatrics as a specialty, a lot of people who publish what would be considered pediatric articles aren't necessarily publishing in pediatric journals. You've got pediatric oncology, you've got pediatric allergy, pediatric immunology. There's any number of fields, and so those more general categories also suffer a bit from that as well. So I guess the message here again is just making sure that you've done your research, that you're not putting too much emphasis on one source, on one metric, but thinking about it from a balanced perspective. And once you've selected that journal, I do encourage people to read the instructions for authors. I was a managing editor, as was referred to earlier. I spent hours of my life crafting the most magnificent instructions for authors. It was my War and Peace. It was thousands of pages probably if you printed it all out, and no one ever read it. I am convinced. And that's okay. What you need to look for here is what makes a journal unique. You'll start to see, and a lot of journals are playing with some standardization around formatting so you can easily spot the differences. But take a quick look at those instructions for authors just to see if there's anything unusual. You don't have to necessarily flip through all the descriptions about references. It's good to know what style they use, but you don't have to go into depth on there. But do they ask for, say, a bulleted list of clinical implications? Do they ask for a special section that most other journals don't ask for? Those are the things that make it really clear that you've read, that you're considering this journal properly, you've done your evaluation. Like I said earlier, the journal you submit to first isn't necessarily going to be the journal that ends up publishing you, but no editor wants to get a paper that's obviously been formatted for science and is submitted to them without anything to indicate that it's them. So think about that carefully. As you go to submit to a new journal, are there any changes I need to make here, any modifications? If you have a cover letter, make sure that you've changed the title of the journal in that cover letter. Make sure that you've addressed the correct editor. Certainly don't begin it with "Dear Sir." That's a colleague of mine who works over on The Lancet. That is one of her pet peeves, and she will admit she's negatively predisposed towards any paper that comes in that says "Dear Sir." So just be mindful of these sort of things as you go from one journal to another, that you've actually taken a look at it and what's appropriate. Before we move to the next section, any further comments? No? Any questions from the audience about selecting a journal?